I want to make just 5 quick comments on what you just saw, because each one of them, I think, goes to our larger purpose. One of them is, on this day that the wall came down, there were a lot of very unhappy members of communist parties, including in Moscow, because their bargaining power had just been taken away with the end of the wall and the control of those populations. But there was also a very interesting, very unhappy person, and we have the documents of the conversation. The West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl was not in Germany on this day. You know where he was? He was in Warsaw, where he was meeting with Lech Wałęsa. And in the conversation they have on the afternoon, while crowds are gathering at the border, and ultimately that night pushing through the border, Wałęsa is complaining to Kohl that the events in East Germany are going way too fast. And could you please slow them down? And Kohl says, well, yes, we won't let them get out of control. We don't want to scare the Soviets, or as President Bush said, stick fingers into the Soviet eyes. But Wałęsa's concern was different. He said, if these events keep going the way they're going, East Germany will not exist, and all of your attention, meaning Kohl and his very wealthy West German economy, he was there in Poland to give help to the new Solidarity government, you'll all be focused on East Germany, and pity poor Poles, we won't get any money from anybody. Wałęsa complains and asks Kohl to slow things down on the afternoon that the wall falls. So fascinating, just where you stand depends on where you sit. A second point I just want to draw your attention to, the Chinese solution. They don't make it so clear in this show, but the Tiananmen tanks were on the same day that the Poles voted in Poland for solidarity in the first round. The same day. Here you had the 2 roads. Talk about the Robert Frost road, roads diverged. And the folks all over Eastern Europe had very different notions of whether the Chinese solution would come home to them. In a series of conferences we did with the Cold War History Project all over Eastern Europe on the 10th anniversary of the 1989 events, at every one we asked the dissidents and the opposition leaders, what was the day that you first believed the tanks would not come? And Zbigniew Bujak in Poland, great underground solidarity leader, said, oh, I thought that the last possibility for the tanks coming was really the day Brezhnev died in 1982. Interesting. The great Czechoslovak dissident Willem Prečan, who had been publishing the Samizdat and doing extraordinary material for Charter 77, was expelled from Czechoslovakia from the Academy of Sciences. He said, well, I wasn't even completely sure even after the Berlin Wall fell on November 9th. He said it wasn't until November 29th that I was comfortable that the Czech security forces wouldn't come in with tanks and crush the Civic Forum. And here you see this amazing role of perception of the threat. And when in the show it has the Hungarian leader, Reform Communist Nemeth, talking about his meeting with Gorbachev in the spring of 1989, where Gorbachev says to Nemeth, no, we won't come in. Actually, the transcript of that meeting is far more ambiguous. It says, we're not going to interfere, it's your own business, we applaud the path you're on, we think that's okay, but there is a limit, and the limit is the existence of socialism. This is this ambiguity. On the one hand, Gorbachev could say publicly, we're not going to come in with tanks. And yet it worked very much to his political benefit to have some ambiguity and have some sense on the outside. You heard it in President Bush's phrase, stick our fingers in the eye of the Soviet military, the people to the right of Gorbachev, the conservative forces. And there were those voices speaking pretty loudly in Moscow all through this period. So the Chinese solution, and a great irony, obviously, is in 2 weeks, people will be walking through that square with the big Olympic rings, right? It's a wonderful thing to point to that footage in particular. I think those folks are not going to be entered in the bicycle races in the Olympics, so they're getting somebody to the hospital. A third point was just about the old communist leaders of Eastern Europe, and everyone laughed at Honecker. And in effect, that was the Soviet strategy, was to get rid of the folks like Honecker, the little Brezhnevs, and replace them with little Gorbachevs. That was, in effect, the strategy. My favorite image, actually, of Erich Honecker you notice that when Gorbachev greets him and he does the embrace, he's careful to move his head to one side because Honecker was well known as a full frontal kisser. And there's a very famous photograph of Leonid Brezhnev in Berlin doing a lip lock with Erich Honecker. And the Hungarian opposition movement, the Fidesz party, the youth movement in Hungary, created a campaign poster out of this for the 1990 Hungarian elections. And they did the top frame of the poster was the lip lock of Honecker and Brezhnev, and the bottom frame was an attractive young couple in a park on the banks of the Danube. And the poster said, "Your choice." right. It's just a wonderful image. The Gelman Library has a collection of posters that were put together by Jim Hirschberg, the former director of the Cold War Project, and of 1989 posters from the reburial of Naj to this campaign. This is one of the great posters in that series. My bet is, and I think there's an online version of this poster display which Mircea can put you in touch with. Great just images. The one from Romania is the back view of a Soviet colleague in a very recognizable hat and overcoat with a suitcase. And it's Ceausescu. It's supposed to be Ceausescu. Except it's essentially adios comrade, right? is the message. It's a fascinating, just that dynamic of the old leaders and how even the new reform leaders were trapped by their own jargon. You heard people talking about Egon Krenz. Well, he doesn't really have much to offer, just his big teeth. What was interesting in the German situation, that whole press conference where Schabowski sort of says, well, I guess it's now, I guess it's open now. He was actually, he didn't notice at the end of his instructions, it said, well, we're going to wait, phase this in, it's going to be visas, it's going to be this, it's going to be that. You have this extraordinary testimony to the role of contingency and individual choice. To me, this is the great challenge that you face and that I face in bringing the Cold War alive and trying to teach it. Because as John Lewis Gaddis frequently says, the great virtue of the Cold War as a teachable subject is we know how it ends. But because we know how it ends, it makes us think, oh, well, it's had to end that way. It was, in effect, overdetermined. Well, of course, Soviet Union had to collapse. Of course, the Cold War had to come to an end. And restoring some of those kind of individual choices to the mix is why I like the video, because you see these different voices of dissidents and policymakers. You see some very different kinds of policymakers. The reason I passed out this Chernyayev diary excerpt is actually two excerpts. One is from the day Gorbachev goes to see Honecker in October 1989. This is the national security advisor to the head of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, and he's applauding the end of socialism. This is extraordinary testimony to a new way of thinking in Moscow. He is actually saying the reunification of mankind on the basis of common sense. That's what we're doing here. Chernyayev has now donated the complete handwritten text of his diaries from the day he started them in 1971 through the end of the Soviet Union in 1991 to the National Security Archive, because he was afraid that in Moscow the Yeltsin and Putin regimes would clamp down, repossess them, like they've done so many of the other archives. This is a different way of thinking, and then turn it over and just look at his reaction to the actual fall of the Berlin Wall. This is the most important foreign policy advisor to the head of the Soviet Union, and he thinks it's great. And only our, quote, best friends, Castro, Ceausescu, Kim Il-sung, are around and they hate our guts. Right? That's what's left of communism. What you see here is, in effect, the new thinking project of Gorbachev and the people around him. I would say the people around him were far more thorough new thinkers, and you can see it in Chernyayev in particular. He had been in Prague in the 1960s. He had been part of that socialism with a human face. It had a huge impact on him. He brought it back, but not until Gorbachev did he have an opportunity to help make change at the high level. Gorbachev was quite ambivalent through this period, and you can see it throughout these documents. But people like Chernyayev, Yakovlev, Shakhnazarov were serious new thinkers pushing the envelope. So that sort of reinsertion of the human element is what I want to do in this next section of the talk. But I want to note two more quick things from the show. You heard Ulrike Pope, the East German dissident, talk about the videotape that was across the street, recording every family argument over the dishes. To me, one of the most fascinating experiences you can have as a tourist is to visit the Stasi archives in Berlin. And they've actually restored the regional Stasi archives in the different regional capitals as well. And you get a sense of the mammoth quantity of surveillance material, and you ask yourself, why, if with all this surveillance capacity, did they not see it coming? And there's a short answer. They choked on it. They surveilled so much. 1 in 7 East Germans was on the payroll one way or another as an informer. To service a videotape like that, what the people in the Stasi archives told us, to service a single wiretap microphone on somebody's phone or a single video camera like the one pointed into her window required 6 full-time people. You had your shift workers, you had your technical person to make sure it ran, and you had your transcribers. So if you're being absorbed, your security energy is all being absorbed on the surveillance front. Fascinating. It reminds me of who was the guy, David Brin, brother of the founder of Google, who said, oh, if you're worried about the government listening in on your conversations and getting copies of your email, have more conversations and send more email. That's really your only defense, is sort of volume. And that swallowed the East German system. But let me come back to the role of individuals and human agents and choice. And I want to step back and take a little bit more of a long view and then move us up to the interaction with US policy. Because to me, if I had to do a short list, and originally the Cold War Project is what got me to think in this way. They asked me, okay, come up with individual stories that mattered to bring about the end of the Cold War, that maybe weren't seen at the time. And I came up with a pretty unusual, not your usual list of suspects. You know how in the movie Casablanca they say, okay, round up the usual suspects, and everybody laughs and they go get the usual suspects. But the people that I would put on my list, I would start with a Chinese marshal named Chun Yi, Chenyi, Chun Yi. I would put a American civil rights icon named Ella Jo Baker on my short list. I would put a high-tech entrepreneur, who's now quite famous because he provides your iPods, but he did another much more interesting thing in 1975-76, a guy named Steve Jobs on my short list. And these are, I'm not saying these are people who were personally instrumental. I'm saying as metaphors, they are causes of the end of the Cold War. They illustrate these larger trends outside of an individual decision or a mess up at a press conference. I would put a Finnish diplomat named Max Jacobson on my short list. I would put 2 Polish women who were in that Gdansk shipyard in August 1980, named Alina Piankowska and Anna Valentinowicz on my short list. And then I would end my list with Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev. And I'll come back to that because this is the way I want to wrap up this afternoon, is talk about the history and how it essentially has presented us with a debate over, well, who ended the Cold War, who deserves credit for it, who won the Cold War, and it kind of comes down to 2 schools. Oh, it was Reagan. Oh, it was Gorbachev. Hugely simplistic. And I want to argue a third possibility, which is it was actually the interactivity between them that was crucial to the end of the Cold War. So let me go back to the top of my list, this Chinese marshal. Why would a Chinese person, if they were responsible for Tiananmen and this terrible, violent road not taken in Eastern Europe, but a road that really shaped China today, how did a Chinese marshal who actually died 2 months before Richard Nixon arrived in China in 1972 for that great visit to China, that historic moment in the Cold War, why would a Chinese marshal be important to this process? And I would say this, that what's been fascinating about getting into the documents from the other side is getting out of our head of being so American-centric or Washington-centric or policymaker-centric, and think about what were the ways that other people drove the processes? And Chun Yi was a marshal, an elite, who'd been purged during the Great Cultural Revolution by Mao. He was essentially in internal exile. He was assigned with 3 other marshals to a particular factory in Beijing where he was supposed to be a quality control inspector, but actually it was an excuse to give him a small office where they could drink tea all day. And then one day, he got an order from on high, you got to do a study of what we need to do. This is early 1969. Border clashes with the Soviet Union. Chinese are dying up on the river in the north. The questions posed from the center to the marshals was, okay, you're sitting there drinking tea in the factory. Are the Soviets going to attack us? What should we do about them? And the marshals say, but wait a second, there's a party political statement. We don't want to say something that's not the party line. Or you ask us to do something, we can regurgitate. That'd be fine. We can do that. That'd take an afternoon. He said, no. The message from Mao Zedong through Zhou Enlai to the marshals was, no, come up with something new, really. Sky's the limit. And so what they did was they reached back into Chinese history and they talked about, well, we've got a problem with, and this was the phrase they used, the near barbarians, meaning the Soviets. And what historically Chinese regimes had always done when you had a problem with near barbarians was go find some far barbarians to bring in and do a balance. And these guys, over a period of about 8 months, wrote a series of reports to Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, and they've been published in the Cold War International History Project Bulletin, in which they actually used the phrase. Now try flipping on its head. You know, we talk about the opening to China, American opening, American entrepreneurship, American brilliant diplomacy. The marshals talked about bringing the far barbarians and playing the American card. Playing the American card, meaning against the Soviet Union. And they gave Mao, in effect, analytical cover. Oh, here's these distinguished marshals who can do a study for us, and we'll use that and push it through the Chinese political system and reach out to the Americans. One of the things we know today, because of pioneering scholarship by Chun Jin and other fellows of the Cold War Project, is Mao's motivations here were not only about the Soviet Union and playing the American card against the Soviet Union. Mao's motivations were also that he himself and the party had lost legitimacy because of the failures of the Cultural Revolution and the leap forward. And he needed a foreign policy success. Traditionally, emperors needed to be seen as emperors. It was part of legitimacy. And I'll come back. Legitimacy is going to be a key element of the themes, both for the US, for the Soviet Union, and for China. But here the marshals said, reach out to the far barbarians. Now we know, and we have the internal Chinese documents about setting up the welcome ceremony for Nixon. So he would take a specified number of steps off the plane that then would repeat the number of steps that barbarian chieftains had to walk to give tributes to the emperor 1,000 years earlier. And these references are extraordinary and deep and hard for foreigners to catch. But what you see is Chinese agency in bringing the Americans. The core condition, they said, we're not going to go to Washington. That was one of the first messages passed in any of the secret channels, Pakistani channels or others. How does this get us to the end of the Cold War? Well, after Kissinger's third trip to Beijing, he wrote a little briefing memo for President Nixon in which he said the following statement, which is fascinating. To me, this is one of the markers of the end of the Cold War. He said, now China is our tacit ally, quote, tacit ally, unquote. That's 1972. The historian Nancy Burnkoff Tucker commented in a film that we did that won the Emmy a couple of years ago. She said, you know what that means? That means in 1972, there were more communists on Washington's side than on Moscow's side. Think about what that means for the Cold War. Fascinating. Now let me move to my next character, and this is an American civil rights movement hero named Ella Jo Baker. Ella Jo Baker didn't intend to do anything to help win the Cold War. In fact, she thought the Cold War was a huge distraction. She thought in the context of the civil rights movement that the Cold War was the way in which freedom was denied in the United States. She believed, she saw people like Strom Thurmond and others leading the opposition, the segregationist movement in the United States, and she saw this kind of the anti-communism rhetoric as exactly that, simply a tool. She didn't care about that international competition. What she was about was freedom in the United States. She was key in 4 major turning points in the civil rights movement. She was key in the very first mobilization, the recruitment by the NAACP of returning troops after World War II. And they built an infrastructure and a membership of 500,000 people. And the people that came back from World War II who had an experience even in the segregated armed forces of World War II turned out later to be like Aaron Henry, the head of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement. They were crucial folks, and she helped lay the groundwork with that recruitment. She played a key role in the first big school desegregation case in New York between 1952 and 54 that led to the 1954 Supreme Court decision. They had to pick among cases, and they picked the Topeka, Kansas case, but there were New York cases were simultaneous. Then Ella Baker helped build the infrastructure for Martin Luther King's, the Christian Leadership Fellowship, and then she was the godmother of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And SNCC is extraordinary little organization, far more important than its size or budget, whatever. Among other things, it produced the first feminist manifesto in 1964. You just look at the curve of legitimacy over time, and you see Soviet Union declining. While at the same time, the civil rights movement in the United States meant that the core legitimacy problems that the United States faced as of 1945, its treatment of very significant minorities, its treatment, whether it itself could claim to be a genuine democracy, increased over time as the United States really faced those challenges, passed the civil rights bills, so that by the time of the 70s and 80s, in effect, Americans had successfully created a system where people behind the wall would vote with their feet to come. And you could see some of it visually in the video. And I would just posit that if you're looking at who won the Cold War, one of the interesting ways to get some discussion going is say, well, it wasn't a weapon system, maybe it was the civil rights movement, in the sense of the legitimacy contest, which was huge to the core of the Cold War. Let's Steve Jobs. The reason I throw Steve Jobs in here is because the 1970s were, the mid-1970s in particular, were a period of a sense of crisis in the United States. You'd had defeat in Vietnam, and very few American leaders were willing to say, oh, getting out of Vietnam actually was good for us. There were a number of European leaders who said directly, Giscard d'Estaing told American leaders, you should be happy you're out of Vietnam. It's not a bleeding sore anymore. You can get back to doing what you do well, which is to be a beacon for freedom. Don't napalm jungles anymore. This is a good thing for your standing in the world. That's not how we as Americans saw it. If you take the period of sort of 73, Watergate, Vietnam, 75, through the takeover of the Iranian embassy in 1979, and the famous Jimmy Carter malaise speech, you have a real crisis of self-confidence, if you will. And that's one of Ronald Reagan's great appeals, was that sunny kind of optimism and sense of confidence that he could convey personally. But what's interesting, if you look at it in a global economic perspective, the turning point of the global economic system really occurred in the middle of the 70s with the information revolution, particularly the computer revolution. And what's interesting to me is you think about roads not taken. If we had stayed on the track of the mainframe computer, really, which was the track that we were on. Think about the supercomputers that had helped get our astronauts on the moon. Think about the Crays and the big IBMs. These were huge computers staffed by an incredible elite of scientists in big laboratory settings, very akin to centralized power plants. And in itself, such a way of computing does not conflict with the Soviet way of doing things. In fact, Vasily Leontiev, the Nobel Prize-winning inventor of input-output analysis, only was able to develop those ideas. He was a Russian refugee, immigrant, because of the use of supercomputers, and the people at Gosplan had him back to teach them how to use that, right? So, but it's a conceptual frame, an elite behind the iconostasis minding huge computers. But in 1974, 75, 76, a bunch of hobbyists in California who were mostly motivated by wanting to steal free long-distance telephone services. Literally. These are the so-called phone freaks, and they spelled it P-H-R-E-A-K-S, phone freaks. kept working on little boxes to override the phone company's protections so they could go on, produce certain dial tones, produce certain analog and digital codes, and test hundreds, if not thousands of them really quickly to a dial tone in order to get free phone service. Because they were, in effect, outlaws. They were more hippies. There was a group of them called the Home Brew Club that met in Palo Alto. And on an April day in 1976, you had a couple of guys named Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs showed up with a chunk of wood about this big. You can actually go on the Apple website. There's some other places you can find it. You just look for the earliest Apple computers. And it really does look something you would make in your back porch or garage, which is where they made it. It's a piece of wood that they polished a little bit so it looked good with some circuit boards attached to it. And they brought it in and showed it to the Homebrew Club and they go, oh, this is really interesting. Wozniak was the real engineer, but it was Jobs who had the vision. And he said, look, this is the direction because this decentralizes computing power. This is what we're about, a personal computer out of a hobbyist culture. If you look at the history of computing, you will find that it was a Soviet mainframe that was the first one in Europe in 1950. The MESM computer. But in the Soviet system, there was absolutely no capacity for this kind of hobbyist culture, outlaw culture, individualistic culture that then produced this phenomenal process of the development of personal computer from the first introduction in 1977 to IBM then coming out with its PC with some software from a college dropout named Bill Gates, right, in 1981. From 1975, IBM's revenue was was driven by government and large industrial purchases of mainframes. By 1985, more than half of IBM's revenue was PCs. Right there, you've had the information revolution, and the Soviet Union is totally in the dust. There's some wonderful quotes from different historians and other folks, but the best one that I found is actually in the autobiographical book that Putin, in his first year in office after Yeltsin had appointed him, he had sat for some interviews with some journalists, and they then sort of typed it up as a transcript. And it's, I think, the only book out there that actually has his name on the title page, published by Public Affairs Press. And in there he talks about being a KGB agent in Dresden, Germany in the early 1980s and stealing Western technology that had come to the East from West Germany and sending it back to Moscow, computer technology, and then coming back to Moscow on home leave and going into the KGB offices and saying, okay, where's my latest coup? He said, oh, we had to put that on the shelf. We didn't have anybody here who could figure out how to use it. Okay? Road not taken. Here's where Steve Jobs is a metaphor for that division that happened in the mid-1970s and helped contribute to the road that led to the end of the Cold War, because it left the Soviet Union really unable to deal with the information revolution. And people in the Soviet Union knew it. If you read George Shultz's memoirs, you will find that the most fun times he ever had with Gorbachev was when he came and gave him a couple of lectures based on some Stanford courses that Schultz had been part of about the information revolution and how it was changing how markets worked and liquidity and how it was making the West so much more efficient. And Schultz describes Gorbachev as being open-mouthed and fascinated and really interested to see these applications. Of course, the White House itself got its first email system in 1982, pushed by a national security advisor named John Poindexter, who had a PhD in nuclear physics and had been used to using the military's ARPANET when he was in the military. So by the end of the Reagan administration, our lawsuit that saved the White House email from being deleted saved about 250,000 email messages. At the end of the first Bush presidency, that lawsuit resulted in about 480,000 messages being saved. At the end of the Clinton presidency, they handed off 32 million email messages. If we're lucky, we'll get another 30-something million from the current 8 years, but we're currently in court to make sure that handoff actually takes place. But that's Steve Jobs and the sort of information piece. Let's just leap to Max Jacobson, Finnish diplomat, historian. Max Jacobson fascinating character because he's descended from one of the earliest Jewish families ever to immigrate to Finland. And yet as a young man, he found himself fighting alongside German Nazi troops against Soviet communist troops in the Winter War in 1940, where Finland fought the Soviet Union to a draw and assured its own neutrality at some cost. What's fascinating to me about this is Max Jacobson, if the Soviets had won, Jacobson would have been shot. If the Germans had won, he'd have been put in a concentration camp. And this is this interesting role of Finns and Finland, and he particularly played a key role as a diplomat in driving the Helsinki process. This is the Helsinki Final Act of 1975. You notice these are all 1970s things that I'm telling you about, but I think that they are, in the long view, they take us to 89 as explanatory variables of structural change, not just individual, and they put some individuals right back into the mix. So Helsinki Final Act, why was it important? The Soviets had wanted that kind of final act since 1954 as a way to ratify their borders, the borders of Eastern Europe and the Stalin conquest of Eastern Europe. And that was a top goal of their diplomacy. But by the 1970s, the human rights revolution was taking place. It's interesting, a key point might have been the Pinochet coup in Chile. In the year before the Pinochet coup, there were, I think, a grand total of about 200 Amnesty International affinity groups in the whole world. And 2 years after the Pinochet coup, there were 10,000. This is, from 73 to 75, essentially you have the modern human rights movement becomes a focus. Part of the focus was clearly on the Soviet Union and its treatment of its own dissidents, the refuseniks, treatment of particularly Soviets of Jewish descent who were trying to get out, but also the people who wanted to stay. This real focus on human rights meant that for the Soviets to get a final act, the Europeans in particular, and they led this, and with some help from some very smart American diplomats too, insisting on the basket three, the free flow of information, the right to travel, these key parts of the Helsinki Agreement. And what's fascinating about the process is that it was so disrespected by the very top of the American system. We have these amazing Henry Kissinger documents today where he says to his staff, this is not going to make any difference. I don't care if it's written in Swahili. We have these interesting documents where the President of the United States, both Nixon and Ford, say to Gromyko, the Soviet foreign minister, and to Brezhnev, don't worry, we're not going to embarrass you on human rights. Kissinger saying, this thing is not going to matter. It explains one of the puzzles of the Helsinki process. Why did the Soviets go along with the Helsinki Final Act with those human rights pieces? And one reason they went along with it, and we have the Politburo minutes when Gromyko presents it, and Gromyko says to the Politburo, don't worry, we're masters in our own house. That's his quote. We're masters, because he'd been told that by Nixon, Kissinger, and Ford. We're not gonna push you on this. So, but this Helsinki Final Act then got taken seriously by people all over Eastern Europe. Already, Yuri Orlov, a great physicist who had helped the Soviets build their nuclear bombs and an acolyte of Andrei Sakharov, reads it in Pravda because one of the requirements of the act was it be published in these countries. And so the Soviets published it in Pravda. Yuri Orlov reads it. He wrote a fabulous autobiography. He calls up a friend of his, and they were already involved in dissident activity. He says, why don't we, can we meet? I have an idea about how to take this and do something with it. She says, this is Lyudmila Alexeyeva, the extraordinary woman and still the head of the Moscow-Helsinki group today. And they meet in front of the Bolshoi Ballet because it was a notable private place. It was a place of romantic assignations. And the police would stay away a little bit because this is well known as where you met your lover of whatever orientation. And so they sit on a bench together and they're assumed to be meeting there for that purpose. They're actually talking about how to start the Moscow-Helsinki group. And the first reaction of the top Soviet leadership, we have the Politburo notes where they debate this kind of thing. What are those people up to? It's fascinating because their first reaction, we can't crush them. We can't shut them down completely because we've got all these international concerns. Charter 77 happens in January 1977 in Czechoslovakia. The Workers' Defense Group of Poland had already started defending workers before the Helsinki Final Act, but now with that, with their communist governments all having signed to it, provided legitimacy. Again, legitimacy. to their efforts as dissidents. In places like Czechoslovakia, only about 1,700 Czechoslovaks ever signed the Charter, 77. Minute fraction of the population. And yet it was a kind of a beacon that everyone could point to later on in 1989 of how they could be ready to take over. In Poland, you ultimately had, 6 to 10 million Poles involved in solidarity one way or another in 80 and 81. So very different reactions in different countries, but the Helsinki Final Act was just crucial to it. And William Hyland, I think, who was one of Kissinger's aides, says, if you could say the Soviet Empire started to crack anywhere, it was at Helsinki, 75. And nobody saw that at the time. The Helsinki Final Act was denounced by the great Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn, said it was a sellout. It was editorialized against by the New York Times, who said, this is a giveaway to Stalin. Ronald Reagan was running for president in the Republican primaries against Jerry Ford, said, absolutely terrible, we shouldn't do it, right? Unintended consequences of a principled position driven by the human rights movement and these European diplomats and this Finnish guy, Max Jacobson, put a legitimacy test into international law that the Soviet system ultimately flunked. Very key, because by November 1989, it's the dissidents and the people who can cite to the Final Act are the people who have the legitimacy in those countries, not the communist regimes. Let me talk about two solidarity activists, because I think the biggest crack of the Soviet system was not necessarily at Helsinki, but right across the Baltic at Gdansk. Because here was a revolution, the revolution in Poland, that was the personification of the antithesis of communism. It was a workers' revolt against the dictatorship of the workers, right? It involved a huge percentage, ultimately, of the Polish population. It took its very name from the communist anthem, Solidarity, right? It's about solidarity. And it made a common alliance with the Catholic Church as well as its base. So you have this fascinating combination of forces, and yet the story of solidarity could have been very, very different, except for very brave action by two women, Alina Piankowska and Anna Valentinowicz. Now, Anna Valentinowicz was the one who actually started the Gdansk strikes in August 1980. She was the tiniest welder in the Gdansk shipyard. She could get up into the very front of these ships and mend the struts with her blowtorch. I've met her once, and when I met her, she was 4'10", maybe, in shoes. Her nickname was Tiny in Poland, right? But she was so highly respected, she was fired from her job for the simple act of collecting the burned down candle stubs. Anybody been in a Catholic church, and particularly Eastern Europe, and you burn candles to the deceased, right? She collected the candle stubs because wax was precious, candles were precious, on the monument to the workers who'd been killed in 1970, in the 1970 protests. And she was going to remix them into other candles and keep the candles going. And she was fired for stealing. And the protests started because she was so well respected. And these are the protests that quickly another shipyard worker named Lech Wałęsa emerged as a natural leader. A committee of the intellectuals, Jacek Kuran and others, who were already involved in defending workers from the mid-1970s, join in a statement of principles in support of the Gdansk workers. This is around August 14th. On August 15th, at least 36 other enterprises, state enterprises around Gdansk and a couple in Warsaw, go out on strike in sympathy and in support of the Gdansk shipyard workers, who are amazed by this, because this is an actual act of solidarity and risk to their own livelihood. On August 16th, 1980, the shipyard director folds, grants the reinstatement of Anna, and offers some wage increases. Everybody go back to work. There's a big triumphal meeting. It's described in part by Michael Dobbs in a book called Down with Big Brother, but there are other great places where this is described. Timothy Garton Ash probably wrote the best book about solidarity. Everybody cheers, and they march out to go get a pivo, a beer. Except these two women, Alina and Anna, rush to the gate and yell to the crowd, "But wait, We've only won here. What about all the people who are on strike in support of us? What's going to happen to them? They're going to be fired. We have to stay in solidarity with them. They've got demands too. Out of 15,000 people who were in the big rally where they announced the raise and the settlement, only about 400 stayed with Alina and Anna. But one of them was Wałęsa, several of the intellectuals. They stayed, they produced Gdansk's demands, they forced the regime, and that was, in effect, the brilliant moral clarity of solidarity was on display there for the first time. Because we're not just in it for us. We're not just bargaining for our wages or for our colleague. We are actually standing up for everybody, for all of us, solidarity. So a breakthrough moment. The interesting epilogue to this story, just taking these two people as metaphors, one of them went on to be a senator in the Polish, elected in the Solidarity sweep in the summer of 1989, Alina. And she ultimately died of cancer. Very sad loss to Poland. The other one, Anna, Tiny, the welder. She never got elected to anything. And in fact, she thought the whole free market reforms that occurred in Poland were terrible. When she retired to her pension, a New York Times reporter did a profile of her in the Times Magazine in 1999, 10 years later. He went back and found some of the heroes. And she sits there saying, I didn't want capitalism. I didn't want capitalism. I didn't want to be hired and fired. I wanted a different kind of system, but a real socialist system. And she was enormously disappointed with the outcome in Poland. These are the very different trajectories, and yet a moment of individual moral choice that made an enormous difference.